All right, welcome everybody to the FitPro show. My name is Emily, fitness program manager over at the Fort Collins, Colorado site. And then of course we got David joining us over at Houston. Thanks for joining us. I hope you're having a good week so far. We're looking forward to having this discussion today on intensity levels. So we're going to talk about intensity levels when it comes to strength training and also cardiovascular training. So the one thing that I kind of wanted to start off the conversation with is kind of talking about intensity and what that kind of means. So for me, the way I kind of explain it to folks is workout intensity really has nothing to do with how long you train or how many days a week you train. It's more about how hard you're training or how hard you're not training. So there's different levels of it. And so we're going to break those down and how you gauge each of those and, different ways that you can gauge those, say you don't have a, what am I thinking? A monitor or anything, how you can kind of gauge that. And so one of the things that I want to talk about first, I guess, is, well, Dave, do you want to talk about cardiovascular strength first?
Yeah, we can go either way. Let's start with cardio.
Okay. So different ways with that is your heart rate. And I know it's kind of, it depends on your age, right? And your physical condition. So, you have your max heart rate, therefore, your heart rate's going to be in different zones. And that's going to be in different levels of intensity. So, David, how do you like to kind of break this down? I know there's tons of different charts. That's normally how I look at it, depending on who I'm working with, because everybody's a different age and whatnot. So, how do you like to break that down?
Yeah, so I'll talk about some heart rate stuff since we're getting into cardio, but I think Emily did a good job of kind of just starting out by saying, hey, what is intensity? Because we talk about all these different variables, right? And we think about volume and frequency and density and complexity and all these things. And oftentimes all those are just kind of put in one realm and we think, oh, I had an intense workout, when us as fitness professionals making workouts for you guys, programs, that kind of stuff, intensity is just one of those variables alongside of those. So when we talk about intensity, just know that we're talking about a variable, not just, hey, I sweated during that workout or what, I got really sore, it was intense. There's different ways of gauging those. So we'll talk about cardio first, and then we'll talk about some strength stuff. So for cardio, I do the max heart rate like Emily was just talking about, and just a simple way to get a good idea of where you're at is that 220 number minus your age. That's a good general place to be to know, okay, this is around my max heart rate. That can vary some from person to person. If somebody's really fit, does a lot of cardio, things like that, it might be higher. If you're not very fit, you don't do any cardio at all, it might be a little bit lower. But that gives you a good place to start when we talk about these heart rate zones. So that's what your max is. And then if we talk about like beats per minute, just like a resting place that we're at, then that's literally just what you can do that resting heart rate. And then from there, we figure out some different heart rate zones. And it can be really vigorous, very intense. We can be moderate, we can be low intensity. And there's different ways to train that too, high, moderate, and low. But if we're going to keep talking about the heart rate stuff, then when I think max intensity, developing like speed, performance, things like that, we have to go really hard and do like sprints and things like that, and it's going to be 90 to 100% of that heart rate. Okay, so just as high as you can possibly go there, and you're only going to be able to do that for a very short amount of time. So that's why we talk about high intensity, we talk about those intervals. As we keep going down, different zones. I think the next, just to keep it simple for us here, like 80 to 90%, still really vigorous. We're working at like a max capacity here. So it's not maximal heart rate, but it's a work capacity that you can do a little bit longer of your interval. Maybe it's over a minute or so and you're at that 80 or 90%, and that's called anaerobic zone. And that's when you're just getting that capacity again. When you dip down a little bit lower, that's going to be an aerobic zone where you're like 70 to 80%. And that zone that you're in right there is going to be like your aerobic fitness, just general blood circulation, good, nice cardio workout, right? Still on the higher end, but nothing crazy. If we keep going down that chart, then it would be like 60 to 70%, where you're going to improve that basic endurance. You're in like a fat burning zone, which I don't necessarily like that term or use that term because they all burn fat, but you'll see that in the literature, but you're in the fat burning zone. And I get that question a lot from people. Do I have to be in this certain zone to burn fat? Not necessarily. The percentage of fat that you're burning at that time, you're using more fat, but it doesn't mean that you're taking fat off your body, right? It's just fat versus carbohydrate that you're using in that moment. So just a way to clarify that, those are like 60 to 100%. If you go to like the 50 or 60% for me to wrap up this heart rate talk, 50 to 60% is just like a general warm up. And you can do that to kind of get your, blood flowing, things like that when you're going into a workout. And then something else that it does, and I use this too, it can actually aid your recovery too. So if you are really sore from a workout or really fatigued from a workout, doing something low level, 50%, 50, 60% can kind of aid that recovery process as well.
All right. I like that. I keep going in and out. I'm not sure. I'm plugged into my Ethernet cord, so I apologize, everyone. I think that was a great explanation of heart rate zones. If anybody has any questions on that, feel free to put those in the chat box or unmute yourself. What about RPE, rate of perceived exertion? I know there's a couple different ways we can gauge that. What's your best take on that?
Yeah, so I like that one because it's a lot simpler and you don't have to like be checking your device or anything like that.
Yeah.
You can grade yourself. It's a
Right.
1 to 10. We're not talking percentages and like checking things. It's like a 1 is you're laying in bed, you're not doing anything, no exertion whatsoever. 10 is like, I need to sit down, I feel like I'm gonna die, right? It's like all the way up through there. So it's pretty common sense here, and that's why I like using this one for cardio. If you're in the 1 to 4, it's pretty darn low. If you're in the 5 to 7, you're in that moderate space. If you're in 8 to 10, you're really getting after it. So we have a way to just rate that exertion and kind of get an idea of where you're at. So that's something that you can use if you're on a jog or on a treadmill or whatever cardio you use. You can at any time say, oh, I'm probably like at a 5 on the scale. I'm working kind of hard, I'm breathing a little heavier, but we can still have this conversation. Is that the same way you do it?
Definitely. Yeah. And that's the one that I like to kind of explain to people when they're first starting out. Cause like you said, it's the most simplest form of it. And then they're not like really, sometimes, with, your heart rate and stuff and finding those zones, it can be confusing. And then they're trying to look at their watch, like you said, and so yeah, that's normally how I like to explain it to folks. And so when we're working out, I'll say, what do you think your RPE is at right now? And that's a good way for me to gauge, okay, we need to either step it up or we need to take it down a notch. And you can also kind of tell too, when you're working with folks, kind of where they're at, based on how heavy they're breathing, facial expressions, all that kinds of stuff. But yeah, I think that one's probably the simplest form for people just starting out, trying to figure out stuff like this. So yeah, I like that one a lot, definitely.
Yeah, really easy one to use, like you said. And you can, as a trainer, you can kind of tell But when you're getting somebody like practicing that, it's good to ask them as well. For anybody too that has gone above and beyond and done, not relying on that 220 minus your age for that max heart rate. If you do any type of cardiovascular test, like a stress test or whatever, on a treadmill, whatever it may be, they'll be asking you your RPE along the way, even though everything is like on the computer monitor right there as you go along. So they can see what it is, and then they can kind of get how you're feeling too. And that's something that I wanted to talk about throughout, no matter if we're talking about cardio, if we're talking about strength. There's a difference here between like subjective and objective, like how you feel versus what the numbers say, or if we're talking about strength, what's the intensity of effort versus your intensity of the load, like the percentages versus how many you think you can have left in the tank. So that's something that we have to have that conversation. That's how you're feeling versus like kind of what the numbers are saying. But I'm glad that we got to talk about those different like heart rate zones and how we gauge those. I think the next place to take it, since we're talking about cardio, is okay, how do we put that into action, right? How do we train for low intensity, moderate intensity, and then high intensity? I spoke on it just a little bit earlier. If it's high intensity, it's going to have to be intervals. If you're actually working at a high intensity, you're not going to be able to do that for a long amount of time. So whatever it may be, if maybe it's 15 seconds going all out and then 45 seconds of rest, or 20 seconds going all out. I have an assault bike right here, so I'll do like 20, 25 seconds, and then I'll have to take almost a full minute to make sure I'm at that high intensity once again, because if I'm not taking that time, my intensity is going to go down to a moderate.
Yeah,
place,
for sure.
right?
Yeah, and that makes total sense. I hope that makes sense to everybody else. That's normally, how I do it too. When I train for that high intensity, I'm maybe doing, I'll try and shoot for that 20-second range, but I'm probably more at that 15. And then, like you said, I'm resting for probably that minute. Because if I don't, I know I'm not going to make it to the amount of sets that I want to.
Right.
I think, what about moderate? What would you say for that?
Yeah, so we'll go on to moderate. I would just say, so we said very similar numbers. I would say if you're doing high intensity intervals, it needs to be somewhere like the lowest, maybe 10 seconds of really hard work. You better be working hard if you're only doing 10 seconds though. And then 30 seconds like at the very top, because at the end, if you get fatigued there, it's not going to be the intensity we want.
For
So
sure.
that's usually where I put people, 10 to 30 seconds doing that hard sprint interval of whatever you're doing.
Yep.
Okay, onto moderate. When I think of moderate, that's something like a jog or something like that. Or if you're on the elliptical, like we were talking about with that moderate RPE, and you're sweating and you're definitely feeling that heart rate is up. But if somebody's next to you, you can do the talk test, and you can still kind of hold that conversation, right? That's how I kind of gauge that moderate. Is that what you do?
Yeah, I do the same exact thing.
Okay.
I'll be like trying to like have a little bit of a conversation with them, and that's kind of how I'll gauge that. Yeah, exactly the same way.
Cool. Yeah, and so if we go down to low intensity, then I think of something like something general, like a walk, maybe an incline walk.
Yeah.
Again, that can be something that's used as a way to like burn some extra calories without interfering with some of your other work, because it's not something that's going to make you super sore or super fatigued, and it's something that can even aid that recovery, like I was saying, because you're getting that blood flowing a little bit more.
For sure. Yep, I completely agree with that. Now, quick little question for you. When just talk to yourself.
Good question. So Chrissy asked us, if you're by yourself, how do you gauge? Just talk to yourself. Is that what you do, Emily? Do you talk to yourself?
I mean, I can gauge it just because of how I feel, I guess. That's just like, my heart, how I'm breathing too. Like my breathing is for sure somehow how I gauge it. Like if I am just like, I know I'm at a high intensity, and if I know I'm just kind of breathing a little heavy, then I'm kind of at that moderate. And if my, breathing's just kind of like, it's higher than normal. My heart rate, is a little higher than normal. I'm kind of at that low intensity. So for me, that's kind of how, like, I was just on my run today, and I was at that moderate. I was doing a trail run, and so sometimes you kind of just get in that zone. You're like dodging rocks and twigs and whatever. And then I took myself up to that high intensity and was at a point where it's like, okay, I got to stop and take a little bit of a rest and just do a walk for a second. So,
Yeah.
I don't necessarily talk to myself, but you can, Chrissy.
It doesn't have to be out loud. We're always talking to ourselves in some capacity, right? You got that self-talk going. You're like, okay, I'm at like a 7, and it might not even be a number. That's a good way for us to gauge it when we're working with people. For that 1 to 10, just we have something that we can write down. We know where we need to go. But yeah, if it's just yourself, okay, I'm kind of getting up there. I'm moderate, low. So and you get better at it with time as well.
Yeah.
But I think the last thing for cardio before we go to strength, though, is okay, when do we use those 3? I think we talked about the low intensity. If you need recovery, if you want to burn some extra calories. For me, I usually stay away from the moderate stuff. And that's just because it's specific to what my training goals are, right? I do mostly strength training. And if I'm doing just miles on trails or whatever, that's gonna interfere with if I'm doing heavy training or high volume training 5 or 6 days a week. So I just choose not to do some of that higher impact, moderate intensity stuff. I keep it low intensity for those recovery, calorie burn, or super high intensity, because although it is fatiguing, I only have to train for 10 or 15 minutes, right? And then I'm done with it. And I don't have that pounding once again. It can be something here that I do on my bike or whatever, and it's just those slams, burpee, whatever it may be, right? So that's how I do it. How about you, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of just depends on what I'm training for and what I'm trying to achieve goal wise. Right now, like we were talking right before we started the discussion, I'm trying to get my cardiovascular back up. So I'm kind of staying at that moderate pace. I do always try to go for a walk every day at that low intensity just to burn those extra calories. I like to be outside, get away from my desk. So yeah, it just kind of depends. And I think that goes for everybody. It depends on what your goals are. So yeah, if you guys have any more questions on that though, let us know. If you're trying to achieve a specific goal and are not sure where to kind of gauge that, let us know and we'll be happy to kind of go over that a little bit more based on what your goals are.
Absolutely. Yeah, on to strength, right?
Some of our favorite stuff.
Yeah.
So I think this goes back to kind of what I was talking about in the beginning. So, the intensity has nothing to do with how long you train or how many times you train, right? So I think of when I am intensity for strength training, I am trying to completely exhaust whatever muscle group I am working at. What do you say?
Yeah. So when I think of that, again, we have to go subjective versus objective. That's definitely how we feel. So, and it's again how you feel versus the numbers. When we talk about intensity, I usually think of like either a percentage of a load, or I think about reps in reserve. So how many of those reps do I have in the tank? If it's exactly what Emily was saying, if it's as intense as possible, that means we have 0 reps left in the tank. And usually I would train somewhere between 0 and 5 reps in reserve. And it's something that you guys that's probably the simple way. We'll get into the percentages just like we did with cardio, but I'm starting with the simple one here first. Reps in reserve, you can kind of, if you've been training a little bit, you kind of know how many you have left, especially if you really take it there one time. That's something that I like doing with people. If they're grabbing weights and I think that they can probably do more than that, then we have a set where you really take it to exhaustion. And if that's something, let's say they were doing their 10 reps, right? Using a certain pair of dumbbells. And then I'm like, okay, this last set, you're taking it to exhaustion with that perfect form. But if you do that, you don't have to, if you get a certain number, let's say 15, right? If you get a certain number, then you don't have to do the cardio portion, right? So people are repping out 20. And I'm like, we weren't working at the right intensity this entire time. So it's a really good thing to know, because if you're just using the light dumbbells and you have a bunch left in the tank, you're not going to get these certain goals that you're working for, because the intensity is just simply not high enough. So when I work with people, it's usually 1, 2, 3 reps in the tank. If we're doing more of a recovery session, maybe 4 or 5 reps in the tank. We take it to zero only like maybe once a month. If it's like a big, like a squat, bench press, something like that, where you're moving a lot of weight. If it's smaller muscle groups, you can kind of train that a little bit harder. So that's what I think of as far as one way to measure that. One is definitely reps in reserve. And then the other way would be percentage of 1 rep max. And when we do that, again, there's a bit, it depends what your goal is. It's all about specificity. So if you're training for power, you're training for strength, once you figure out that what your 1 rep max is on something, then you can go 85 to 100% for strength. If it's hypertrophy, it's going to be lower than that, like 75 to like 85%. And then if it's something like endurance, something lower, like 60 to 75%. But know that's a double-edged sword. So when you're working at 60%, guess what? You got to do a bunch more reps. So it's going to start burning at some point. Anything that you would add to either one of those, Emily? Oh, I think she just popped off here for a second. She's going in and out, but yeah. So if there you are.
Sorry.
Did you hear what I said?
No, I didn't. What'd you say?
Okay, so I went through reps in reserve and then our percentage of 1 rep max.
Yeah, I
And
was listening to a little bit of that, the power and strength. Yeah.
okay, cool. Yeah, but I was just saying, so it is a double-edged sword too. If you work at a low intensity, you have to do more reps for that endurance. If you work at a really high intensity, so you're working really heavy, that means that it's gonna feel really heavy, but you only have to do a few reps.
Few reps. Yeah, totally.
And then hypertrophy is squeezed in the middle somewhere. You're in between those intensity thresholds, but then you're like at a moderate rep range too.
Yep, definitely.
Cool. Yeah, so 1 rep max, again, a little bit more technical, just like the heart rate stuff. If you're really trying to get in depth with it, it's something where you'll have to kind of do some testing with your trainer, with yourself, to know how much you can handle. But it's a good way to know how to progress over time, for sure.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Knowing those 1 rep max, you can kind of figure out how you want to do your training style. It's all based on your goals too, right? But I think knowing those numbers are, I wouldn't say it's crucial, but I think it's good to know that. I think a lot of people, I don't know, I feel like a lot of people look at it like, oh, well, I'm not, bodybuilding or anything, so I shouldn't know that. But it's also just nice to know that because, say you're wanting to do more of that hypertrophy range. It's an interesting thing. And like you said, it's very specific to the person. And so if you are looking to figure that stuff out, test it with yourself, will be safe. Work with a trainer too, if that's available to you. That's, I think, the best way to kind of do it.
And when you're testing too, we're saying percentage of 1 rep max just because we need percentages to work off of, but that doesn't mean that we have to put you under a bar and we're like, all right, here's this heavy load, you got to do 1, hope it looks good, right? We're not going to do that. If you're training for endurance, we might do like a 10 or 12 rep max, and now we at least know where we're starting and we know where we can get better. We know where we need to go. Same thing for hypertrophy. Maybe I do like a 6 to 10 rep, anything in between, 8 rep max, whatever. And if that's where you're comfortable working and that's kind of where your goals align, again, we can see where we're at. If you have good form and you can do some of the strength stuff, and you want to get really brutally strong in the 1 to 5 rep range, that's when we can do a 3 rep max, something like that. But don't think that this means that you have to go and do a 1 rep max. We just need some place to start. And when we're working from home, that might be, okay, we're doing a push up or we're doing a perfect inverted row, and we're seeing how many you can do. We're taking it to that 0 reps in reserve, and we're seeing where you're at right now. We can train for a while, and then we can test it again, and then see where we're at again.
Yeah. And I think the one thing there too is good form, right, guys? Like, we don't want to be getting
Always.
hurt. Yeah, we
Always.
don't want to be getting hurt. And put the ego aside. It's not, that's like one of the biggest things I see with folks is like, well, I wanted to get to that 20th rep. And so I did it, and I did X, Y, and Z to my body just to get
Yeah.
that 20th rep. Like, was that worth it? I don't think so.
And it doesn't even count in my
Yeah,
eyes.
exactly. Yeah. And at that point, it doesn't even count because
So
your
yeah.
form was, garbage. And so that's one thing that, when you guys are playing around with this, make sure it's good form. Make sure you're activating those muscles the right way. Make sure everything looks good so that you're staying safe. You're also being truthful to yourself, and, that you can do more later on. You'll get there as long as you continue to stay consistent. So don't over push yourself ever.
So I think that we agree on that 100%, that form is never something that's like up for debate for me when we're doing something, because
Never.
like I just said, I mean, if you're really doing something crazy to get those last 2 reps, it doesn't mean your muscles or your ligaments are stronger. It means you're using momentum and you had compensations along the way,
Right.
because you had in your head you're trying to get a certain number. So, and you see it all the time on like exercise videos, and you see somebody doing a quarter squat, and it's like 400 pounds, like 15 reps, bro. And it was 0 reps. It was 0 reps. So yeah, that's always something that you have to think about. No matter what we're doing, it needs to be perfect form. And it's better earlier. It's better right now. It's better today to take a step back and work on that form, because then going forward, you're going to be better for it. Because I know a lot of people that have been training for a while and they have all these bad techniques and things like that. And we have to take a couple of steps back because they're doing more harm than good overall, because they're
Yeah,
just kind of grinding it out.
totally. Yeah. And then that's where, some imbalances show up. And like you said, you got to go backwards. And so it's just, for me, explaining that to people, it's not worth it. I always like to say, just put the ego aside. You'll get there working the correct way, and staying consistent, and you'll get to that 20th rep at whatever weight you're working at or whatever the case may be. So
Yeah.
always like to just throw that in there when we're talking about that kinds of stuff, because that's the most important. We want to obviously train for, certain goals and whatnot, but we also want to make sure that we're not hurting ourselves and we can wake up the next day and continue to train. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That should always be a talking point. And I hope that now we kind of know what intensity is and how we can measure it, and know that it's not necessarily just a hard workout. It can be generally kind of low intensity and still a hard workout if you have other things going, if it's very high volume or something like that. There's a big difference between doing, I don't know, 500 body weight squats versus like a 500-pound squat for 1 rep. Those are 2 completely different things, but each of those is right for somebody, right? Because you can get super sweaty and not be able to walk for a week and stuff like that from the squats, but that does nothing for you if you're trying to gain that 1 rep max. And vice versa, if you're working really heavy all the time and you're trying to work on your endurance, you're losing something along the way. So just making sure that we always have that specificity and that we know what we're talking about. Emily, anything that you would like to end on or add to that before we get out of here?
no, I just wanted to add the safety part, just because that's just one of the biggest things. I see it all the time, and it's one of those things where it's like, oh, I did that last rep when I didn't have any more in the tank, and they know that too. And so I just like to throw that in. But that was the last thing I really had of this discussion. I think we explained everything pretty well with cardio and then going into strength. So cool. Thanks everybody for joining. We love having you guys on. Like I said, if you have any more questions based on your specific goals, feel free to reach out to us. Always happy to have a little bit more discussion based on you and your goals. All right, everybody, we will see you next week. Thanks so much. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.